A mother will always find a way. Imagine hiking alone in the wilderness when, suddenly, you see a massive grizzly bear emerging from the trees. But something is different. In her mouth, she isn't carrying prey, but her fragile, lifeless cub. She doesn't growl. She doesn't charge. Instead, her eyes are filled with desperation, begging for help. This true story will challenge everything you think you know about wildlife. What this mother grizzly did shocked even the most experienced wildlife experts. And what happened next proves that a mother's love knows no limits, not even in the wild. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring story like this. Now, get ready for a journey you will never forget. Snow fell heavily across the dense forests of Alaska, covering the frozen ground in a thick, unforgiving layer of white. The wind howled through the towering pines, swirling ice into the bitter air. A mother grizzly bear trudged through the blizzard, her massive frame weakened by hunger and exhaustion. But she couldn't stop. In her powerful jaws, she carried her cub, small, fragile, barely moving. His once lively brown fur was now coated in ice. His breath was shallow. The warmth of his mother's body was his only remaining comfort. Every step she took drained what little strength she had left, but her mission was clear. She had to save him. She didn't know how humans worked. She didn't understand their machines, their buildings, their medicine. But somehow, she knew where she needed to go. For days, the rangers at the Wildlife Rescue Center had seen her lingering at the edge of the forest. At first, they assumed she was simply hunting. They were wrong. Now, under the heavy snowfall, she finally stepped onto the icy road leading to the facility. The bright lights from the human building flickered through the storm. She was so close. But a new danger awaited her. As headlights approached from the distance, a truck came barreling down the icy road, tires sliding across the frozen ground. The mother bear stopped. Would she be able to reach help in time? Or was it already too late? The blizzard raged mercilessly around her, but the mother grizzly did not falter. Her mission was clear. She had to reach the humans. With every agonizing step, her massive paws sank into the snow, her breath coming out in heavy, steaming puffs. Her cub was growing colder. His tiny body barely moved in her jaws. The weight of his stillness was heavier than anything she had ever carried. But then a new threat emerged. The rumbling of an engine pierced through the howling wind. A truck, its headlights cutting through the storm, sped down the icy road. It was heading straight for her. The grizzly mother hesitated, her powerful muscles tensing. Instinct screamed at her to run, to retreat into the safety of the trees. But she did not move. She stood firm, her body blocking the road, shielding her dying cub from the oncoming vehicle. The truck's tires skidded on the frozen ground, a sharp screech slicing through the air. Inside the cab, Ethan Carter, a wildlife ranger, yanked the steering wheel to the side. "Damn it!" Ethan gasped as the truck swerved dangerously. The massive shape in the snow was unmistakable, a grizzly bear. But something was wrong. Why wasn't she attacking? Why wasn't she running? Ethan gritted his teeth and slammed the brakes. The truck came to a violent stop just feet away from the bear. His heart pounded against his ribs as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Carter. I've got a large grizzly on the road near the Wildlife Rescue Center. Stand by." His breath caught when he saw what the bear was carrying. It wasn't prey. It wasn't food. It was a cub. A wave of shock coursed through him. Why was she bringing her cub here? Ethan had worked in wildlife rescue for years, but never had he seen anything like this. A bear, willingly approaching humans? Seeking help? Slowly, carefully, he pushed open the truck door and stepped out, boots crunching against the ice. "Easy, girl," he murmured, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. The mother bear didn't move. She just stood there, breathing heavily, her golden brown eyes locked onto his. Then, she did something incredible. With the gentleness of a mother cradling her child, she lowered the cub onto the snowy ground. Ethan's breath hitched. The tiny bear didn't move. A painful lump formed in his throat. He had seen this before. Cubs abandoned by mothers when they were too weak to survive. But this wasn't abandonment. This was trust. The mother bear let out a low, desperate moan, nudging the cub toward Ethan. She was asking for help. Ethan's hands trembled. He had never felt so small in his life. He crouched down, his fingers numb as he reached toward the tiny, motionless body. The cub's fur was stiff with frost, his breath so faint it was barely visible. He pressed 2 fingers to the cub's ribs. A heartbeat. Weak, but there. He had to act fast. But before he could lift the cub, the mother let out a guttural, pained sound. Ethan's stomach twisted as he looked up. Her legs were shaking. Then, with a heavy exhale, the mother bear collapsed. A horrifying realization struck Ethan like a lightning bolt. She wasn't just exhausted. She was dying too. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the collapsed mother grizzly. His breath fogged in the freezing air as the realization sank in. She had used the last of her strength to bring her cub here. The snowstorm raged on, thick flakes falling in sheets, coating both mother and cub in an icy shroud. Time was running out. Ethan dropped to his knees beside the cub. The little one was barely breathing, his tiny body curled up in the snow. His fur was covered in frost, his lips pale, and his small chest barely rose and fell. Ethan didn't need a medical scanner to know the truth. Hypothermia was setting in. But what about the mother? He turned to her massive frame. Her golden brown fur, now dusted with white, barely moved with each breath. Her ribs protruded slightly. She was starving. And the tremors in her legs meant she had been pushing herself beyond her limits for hours. She carried her cub through this storm while starving, just for the chance to save him. Ethan swallowed back the emotions welling in his throat. This wasn't just an animal. This was a mother willing to die for her child. But not today. Not if he had anything to do with it. Ethan reached for his radio with numb fingers. "This is Carter. I have a severely hypothermic grizzly cub and a malnourished, collapsed mother. Requesting immediate assistance at the reserve entrance. Over." Static. Then, "Carter, this is dispatch. Roads are iced over from the storm. Emergency response ETA. At least 40 minutes. 40 minutes? They didn't have 40 minutes. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had 2 choices. Wait for help and risk losing them, or act now. The answer was obvious. His truck wasn't far, but lifting a full-grown grizzly bear was out of the question. The cub, however, Ethan wasted no time. He pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped the tiny cub inside. The little one whimpered softly but didn't fight. It was too weak to resist. Now, for the mother. He hesitated. Would she allow him to touch her? Would she attack out of instinct? He locked eyes with the massive bear lying in the snow. Even weak, she was still dangerous. But then, something incredible happened. The mother bear lifted her head just slightly, blinking sluggishly at him. She wasn't fighting him. She knew. She understood. Ethan exhaled a shaky breath. This bear, a creature known for its wild strength and protective nature, was trusting him with her child. He had no time to waste. The cub came first. Ethan sprinted back to the truck, holding the cub close to his chest. Every second counted. The wind howled in his ears, whipping through his hair, but he didn't slow down. His truck was ice cold inside. He cranked the heat up to full blast, placing the wrapped cub on the passenger seat. The little one didn't move. Ethan reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a thermal emergency blanket. He wrapped the cub tighter, his hands gently rubbing the tiny bear's chest to keep circulation going. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "Stay with me." A weak whimper made his breath catch. He was still in there. But Ethan wasn't finished. The mother. He tore open the truck door and sprinted back into the storm. His boots slipped on the ice, and he barely caught himself before falling. When he reached the bear, she was still, almost too still. He kneeled down and placed a trembling hand on her thick fur. Still warm. She was still alive. But how was he going to move her? She was nearly 400 pounds of muscle and fur. Even if he was stronger, there was no way he could carry her alone. His mind raced. Think, Carter. Think. Then, an idea. The tow strap. Ethan sprinted back to the truck, grabbing a heavy-duty tow strap from the back. He had one shot at this. He looped the strap around the bear's massive torso, securing it under her front legs. It wasn't perfect, but it was the only chance he had. Back in the truck, Ethan hit the gas slowly, letting the strap pull gently. The bear didn't resist. Inch by inch, he dragged her through the snow, the truck straining against the weight. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the reserve entrance. Just as the headlights of the emergency team appeared through the storm, Ethan slammed the brakes and jumped out. "They're alive, but they need help now!" The rescue team rushed into action, pulling out medical kits, blankets, and warming equipment. As they worked, Ethan stood back, watching with bated breath. Had he been fast enough? The lead vet pressed a stethoscope to the cub's tiny chest. A long silence. Then, a small, struggling breath. He was still alive. The team turned to the mother bear, checking her vitals. Weak, but there. Ethan felt his shoulders sag with relief. They had made it. But the fight wasn't over yet. Now it was up to the medical team to save them. And Ethan had never prayed harder in his life. The storm had lessened, but the air remained bitterly cold. Inside the Wildlife Rescue Center, Ethan paced outside the emergency treatment room, his fingers curled into fists. His boots tapped against the tile floor with restless energy. The mother grizzly bear lay motionless on the metal examination table, her massive chest rising and falling with uneven, labored breaths. The cub, still wrapped in the emergency blanket, had been placed under a heat lamp on a smaller table. A veterinarian was working tirelessly to keep his fragile body from shutting down completely. Ethan had been in life or death situations before, but this one felt different. He couldn't get the image out of his head. The sight of that mother bear carrying her cub through a raging storm, weak and starving, just to get him here. The desperation in her movements, the trust she had placed in him. And now, all he could do was watch and hope. Dr. Harris, the head wildlife veterinarian, entered the room with a grim expression. "She's in critical condition," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Malnourished, dehydrated, and severely exhausted. Her muscles are in near failure from the exertion. If she hadn't collapsed when she did, she might not have made it." Ethan's stomach twisted. "And the cub?" "He's young, maybe only 4 months old. His body temperature was dangerously low when you brought him in, but he's warming up. His breathing is shallow, but he's fighting. The biggest issue is—" A beeping sound interrupted them. Ethan's head snapped toward the cub's vitals monitor. The line was dipping. Dr. Harris rushed forward, placing a stethoscope to the tiny bear's chest. His assistant, Lily, quickly adjusted the oxygen tube running to the cub's nose. Ethan clenched his fists. "No. Come on, little guy. Don't give up now." Seconds felt like hours as they worked. Then, a slow inhale. The cub's chest rose again, slightly stronger than before. Ethan finally let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "He's holding on," Dr. Harris murmured. "But the next 24 hours will be critical." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew what that meant. The cub wasn't out of danger yet. Ethan turned his attention back to the mother bear. The team had placed IV lines in her massive forearm, pushing fluids and pain medication into her system. Despite her weakened state, there was still something fierce in her presence. Even unconscious, she looked powerful, as if her body refused to give in. Ethan slowly stepped closer to the table. Dr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "Careful, Ethan." "I know." He moved cautiously, stopping just beside the bear's head. Up close, he could see the small scars on her muzzle, the wear of survival etched into her fur. Ethan exhaled slowly, then did something unthinkable. He reached out and gently placed his hand on her paw. The room went silent. Lily and Dr. Harris exchanged glances, but no one stopped him. Ethan wasn't sure why he did it. Maybe it was because she had trusted him with her cub. Maybe it was because she had done everything in her power to get him help. Or maybe it was because he understood. He knew what it was like to fight until there was nothing left. Hours passed. The cub remained under watch, his body wrapped in warmth. The mother bear remained still. Ethan refused to leave. Then, sometime after midnight, something happened. A slight movement. It was small, just the twitch of her claws, but Ethan saw it. His breath caught. Then, slowly, her eyes cracked open. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, her dark gaze locked onto him. Ethan's entire body froze. Lily noticed immediately. "Doctor!" Dr. Harris rushed over just as the grizzly bear let out a weak, raspy huff. She was awake, but she wasn't panicked. She didn't growl or lash out. She just stared at Ethan. And then, in a moment that defied all logic, she turned her head ever so slightly toward the small cub on the other table. Her body was too weak to move, but she still tried. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. Even now, even after everything she'd been through, her first thought was still her cub. A mother's love never wavered. Dr. Harris placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. She's not out of danger yet, but if she's strong enough to wake up, she's strong enough to fight. Ethan's lips parted, but he didn't know what to say, because in that moment, he knew she had never stopped fighting, and neither would he. The Wildlife Rescue Center remained quiet in the early morning hours, except for the steady hum of medical machines and the occasional beep of monitors tracking the vitals of the mother grizzly and her cub. The air was thick with tension, as if the walls themselves understood the gravity of the moment. Ethan hadn't slept. He sat in a chair near the cub's incubator, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. His eyes remained locked on the tiny form nestled under heat blankets, his breathing matching the slow rise and fall of the cub's fragile chest. A night had passed, and somehow the little one was still fighting. The mother bear, still too weak to move much, was awake but barely responsive. Every few minutes, her dark eyes would drift toward the cub, as if she needed to see for herself that he was alive. Ethan had seen many wild animals fight for survival, but this was something else. This wasn't just instinct. This was love. Dr. Harris entered the room, flipping through his medical notes, his face unreadable. "How's she doing?" Ethan asked immediately, standing up. The vet sighed. "She's weak. Too weak to nurse. That's our biggest issue." Ethan's stomach dropped. A mother bear's milk was the cub's only chance at building strength. Without it, survival was uncertain. "We could try a milk formula," Lily suggested from across the room. "We've used it in past rescues." Dr. Harris nodded. "We'll prepare some now. But even if the cub takes the formula, it's still risky. His best chance is with her." Ethan turned toward the mother bear. She seemed to understand. She let out a weak, guttural noise, a sound Ethan recognized instantly. She was calling for her cub. The moment sent a chill down his spine. She had spent days fighting through the wilderness to bring her baby here. And now, even as her body failed her, she refused to let him go. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. "Then we need to get her strong enough to feed him." Dr. Harris nodded. "Agreed. We'll start with IV fluids and high-protein meals. She needs energy." But there was one more problem. Would she eat? They prepared a plate of fresh fish, mixed with vitamin-rich supplements to help boost her strength. Ethan carried it carefully toward her enclosure, stopping just outside the glass barrier. The mother bear lifted her head slightly, sniffing the air. Ethan set the plate down and took a cautious step back. The entire team watched in silence. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, she moved. It wasn't much, just a small shift, but for a bear in her condition, it was monumental. She reached out with one weak paw, dragging herself slightly closer. Her head dipped toward the food, her nose brushing against the fish. Then, finally, she took a bite. A breath of relief swept through the room. "She's eating," Lily whispered, eyes wide. Ethan felt a weight lift from his chest. It was the first step, but they weren't out of danger yet. Hours passed. The mother bear ate little by little, slowly regaining a fraction of her strength. Ethan sat beside the cub's incubator, exhausted but unable to leave. Every movement the tiny bear made sent a flicker of hope through his chest. Then it happened. A small, weak cry, a sound that barely echoed in the large room. But it was there. Ethan's heart pounded. "He's awake," he whispered. Dr. Harris and Lily hurried over, their eyes wide with shock. The cub blinked, shifting slightly under the blankets. His tiny paws twitched, and another small whimper left his throat. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He was calling for his mother. He turned his gaze to the mother bear's enclosure. She had heard it. Despite her weakness, her body tensed. Her ears perked up, and for the first time since arriving, her eyes held something new. Urgency. She needed to be with him. Dr. Harris crossed his arms. "I don't like it." "We don't have a choice," Ethan countered. "She's been fighting for him since day one. He needs her." "But if she's too weak, she won't be." Ethan looked through the glass. The mother bear was trying to stand. The team made a decision. They prepared a controlled introduction, keeping medical teams ready in case the cub was at risk. Ethan carefully lifted the cub from the incubator, his tiny body warm against his hands. The moment he stepped toward the enclosure, the mother bear let out a low, breathless noise. Ethan opened the door and gently placed the cub beside her. Everyone held their breath. The cub whimpered again. Then, slowly, the mother bear shifted her body just enough to nuzzle him closer to her chest. The moment was indescribable. The mother's nose brushed against her cub's fur, and a deep, tired sigh escaped her. She was home. Ethan felt his throat tighten. She had won. She had done the impossible, and against all odds, her baby was safe. The atmosphere inside the Wildlife Rescue Center was thick with tension. The mother grizzly had endured days of exhaustion, hunger, and pain, but she had never once surrendered. Now, with her cub nestled against her side, the final battle for survival had begun. Ethan stood outside the enclosure, his hands resting on the reinforced glass. Every muscle in his body was tight with anticipation. The mother bear was still weak. She had eaten, she had regained some energy, but the truth was clear. She was far from out of danger. The cub, however, was showing signs of strength. He wiggled against her fur, his tiny paws reaching upward, as if instinctively searching for nourishment. Ethan barely breathed. This was the moment of truth. Would she be able to feed him? Or had her body endured too much? Dr. Harris and Lily stood beside Ethan, watching carefully. "She wants to nurse him," Lily whispered. "Look at her." The mother bear shifted slightly, angling her body to let the cub reach her underside. But something was wrong. She let out a weak grunt, her breathing ragged. "She's struggling," Ethan said, his voice tight. Dr. Harris rubbed his chin, deep in thought. If she's too weak to produce milk, the cub won't last long. He needs her nourishment. Ethan clenched his jaw. After everything she had been through, this couldn't be the moment she failed. The room remained silent as the cub instinctively latched onto his mother. A flicker of hope surged through Ethan's chest, until the mother bear suddenly tensed. A pained noise escaped her throat. Her muscles shook, and then she collapsed. The room erupted into chaos. Ethan and Lily rushed forward, while Dr. Harris barked orders at the team. "Get a stretcher ready, now!" The mother bear's breathing had become erratic, her chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. The cub let out a distressed cry, his tiny body pressing against his unresponsive mother. Ethan's hands curled into fists as he watched the emergency unfold. The bear had fought so hard to get here. She had survived the unforgiving wilderness, the agonizing hunger, the desperation of carrying her cub to safety, only to fall at the final hurdle. His heart pounded. This couldn't be how it ended. Dr. Harris's team pushed into action, administering emergency fluids, adjusting IVs, and checking vitals. "The strain is too much for her," one of the assistants said grimly. "Her body is shutting down." Ethan's fists tightened. He had seen too many animals lost to exhaustion and malnutrition. But this was different. This was a mother who had given everything for her cub. She wasn't just an animal to him anymore. She was a warrior. And warriors don't give up. The cub whimpered again, pressing his tiny nose against his mother's fur. Ethan stepped closer to the enclosure, his gut telling him to do something. Anything. Then an idea struck him. "Lily," he said quickly. "We need to simulate natural feeding." Lily frowned. "What do you mean?" Ethan grabbed a warm cloth and wrapped it gently around the cub. If the cub feels his mother's warmth against his body, he'll continue trying to nurse. That might trigger her body to react. If she knows he's still fighting, she'll fight too. Dr. Harris hesitated, then nodded. "It's risky, but we're out of options." Carefully, Ethan guided the cub back toward his mother's underside. The team held their breath. Would it work? Would the mother respond? Seconds passed, then a minute. Nothing. Ethan felt his hope slipping away. And then something changed. A deep, low vibration filled the room. The mother bear, barely clinging to consciousness, let out a weak, exhausted growl. Her paw twitched. Her nostrils flared. She was fighting back. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched the cub continue to nurse. Slowly, ever so slowly, the mother bear's muscles began to respond. "She's trying," Lily whispered. "She's trying to come back." The morning sunlight streamed through the trees surrounding the Wildlife Rescue Center, casting golden hues over the enclosures. The battle for survival had been fought and won. But the journey was far from over. Ethan sat just outside the mother bear's recovery area, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. He had spent the entire night watching over her and her cub. Every time she stirred, every time she let out a soft breath, his chest tightened with hope. The mother bear had survived the night, and for the first time since she arrived, her eyes were clear and alert. Ethan leaned forward as she lifted her head slightly. Her massive frame still trembled with weakness, but her strength was returning. The cub, now full and energized from nursing, playfully tumbled around her, tugging at her fur with his tiny claws. Ethan couldn't help but smile. "She's improving," Lily murmured beside him, careful not to disturb the mother bear. Dr. Harris crossed his arms and exhaled in relief. "It's a miracle she made it." Ethan knew the truth. It wasn't a miracle. It was a mother's unbreakable love. She had survived because she refused to let go. She had endured because she knew her cub needed her. Despite her progress, the question still loomed over them. What came next? "She can't stay here forever," Dr. Harris finally said. "She's a wild bear. Once she fully recovers, we need to make a decision." Ethan nodded. He had been preparing himself for this moment. But how do you tell a mother that she must return to the wild? Would she even want to leave? Lily looked hesitant. What if she's too weak to survive on her own? Dr. Harris sighed. "We'll have to monitor her closely. If she isn't fit for release, she'll stay in a protected sanctuary." Ethan's stomach twisted. He had witnessed the sheer willpower of this bear. She wasn't just any animal. She had carried her cub across miles of treacherous terrain through hunger and exhaustion, just for a chance to save him. This bear didn't need a sanctuary. She needed her home. The next few weeks were crucial. The mother bear's strength steadily returned. Her fur grew thick again, her weight increased, and her movements became stronger. Most importantly, she had started to roam the enclosure more freely. "She's getting restless," Ethan observed one evening. "She's ready." Lily, standing beside him, hesitated. "Are you sure? We can keep her longer." Ethan shook his head. "We don't keep wild animals. We save them. And then we let them go." Lily didn't argue. She knew he was right. The decision had been made. The mother bear would return to the wild. The next morning, a small team gathered at the edge of the reserve. The mother bear stood tall and proud inside the transport cage, her cub tucked close to her side. Ethan pressed a hand against the cold steel bars. She looked at him. Their journey together had been unlike anything he had ever experienced. And now, it was time to say goodbye. With a nod from Dr. Harris, the cage door was lifted. For a moment, nothing happened. The mother bear didn't move. She watched Ethan. And then, she stepped forward. Her paws touched the grass of the forest floor. She turned back one last time, not out of fear, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. She knew. She knew he had helped her. She knew he had saved her cub. She knew this was their goodbye. And then, without another sound, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her cub bounding beside her. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching until the mother bear and her cub were completely out of sight. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying their presence away. He had spent weeks fighting for their survival, and now they were free. Lily placed a hand on his shoulder. "She'll be okay." Ethan nodded. Yes, she would be okay, because she was a mother, and mothers always find a way. This story is a powerful reminder that love, true, selfless love, knows no boundaries, not even between species. The bond between a mother and her child is the strongest force in the world. And sometimes, even in the wildest, most untamed places, miracles happen. If this story touched your heart, remember, compassion and courage can change the world. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in the power of love and resilience. Because some stories deserve to be told, and this was one of them, one of